Right. Hello, viewers. We're recording an episode for our podcast today where our focus will be on the presidential election in the US that's scheduled to take place on Tuesday, which is literally 2 days away. So, my guest, James Leake, is someone who might be a little familiar to some of my viewers here because in the build up to the last US presidential election, which was in 2020, in the very early days of this podcast, I recorded an I recorded an episode, a conversation with James and his sister Catherine about that election. Well, James is a lawyer by training. He has a bachelor's and a master's in law from the University of York, which is where he is right now. But not at the university. He is in the city of York right now. And although he's not an American citizen, just like I am not an American citizen, he has always been a very keen follower of anything and everything regarding courts and elections in the US. So, James, welcome.
Thank you.
So, before I start with the questions, like tell us how excited or not excited, or how terrified or not terrified, or how concerned or ambivalent you are about Tuesday.
Yeah, well, I'm speaking as someone who's based in the UK with a fairly fairly typical like UK or European centrist values. So looking at the choice that Americans are faced with and what their choice means for me and wider Europe and the rest of the world beyond, does you do see where the impacts would be felt depending on who wins this time. I suppose we've already had a bit of a taste of a Trump presidency over the course of 4 years, and I don't really know many people, at least on this side of the pond, who remember those times fondly, and I certainly don't. I think this time the danger is somewhat amplified because I think one of the things that perhaps muted the impact of the Donald Trump presidency the first time around was that he and his team, I still believe to this day, weren't really expecting to win that, and therefore didn't really have all the people in place who would maximize the hold they had over the levers of power. I think this time the reverse is true. I think they have got a very good understanding now of where the levers of power lie and how to pull them, which in a way is basically saying that we are still dealing with perhaps the same threat of a Donald Trump, but one who just knows how to navigate the job a lot more effectively. Which you don't always say with a politician who knows how to do the job effectively is like doesn't necessarily like drag a bad premise, but obviously in the case of what he has said, what he will do, what his manifesto has stated, and the ever sort of like looming threat of Project 2025 thing being implemented, although he's distanced himself from that, seeing that actually being done with strong navigational skills of how power works is quite a scary prospect.
That's an interesting point, actually, the one that you made towards the end. Like, often when we have someone in a position of power and we know that they are actually competent and can basically perform the functions that the public might expect of them, that is considered positive news. Like, I remember a friend of mine who I used to study with when I was a PhD student at Manchester telling me that when he was a civil servant and his boss was Michael Gove, is that possible? Yeah. So when he was a civil servant and boss Michael Gove, his point was like, despite him not uh, being politically aligned with the conservatives or with Michael Gove's personal political positions, he found Michael Gove and his work ethic quite admirable, as in terms of work ethics. I think I ended up saying he had found Michael Gove admirable, but that's not what I'm saying. So he thought that Michael Gove was a very able boss in terms of that role and that role precisely. and only that role. I don't know. Of course, it's a different political system in this country, but maybe one really can't say that, of course, with the US. However, in the first Trump administration, there were people who held high offices who were so-called um, like that guy who was the foreign, like the defense secretary, some general, forgot his name. I forgot his name, but anyway, like there were some people in the first Trump administration who were still quite able in their jobs and would have been uh, under the president under the rule of somebody else also been good names or reasonable names to occupy those positions. But of course, as you mentioned with Project 125 and other things, it is really quite um, it is really quite a scary prospect, like Trump coming into power again. But just in terms of like the polls, do you think? I mean, of course, that's a mathematical thing or a statistical thing. Like, do you think this new Seltzer poll that's saying Harris might take Iowa is indicative of what might happen in the swing states? Because I think there is some kind of a strange fact that has been true for many, many years. Like, no one has lost the US election after winning Pennsylvania since, I don't know, some year, many, many decades ago. So, anyway, I mean, are you paying any attention to the polls? Or do you think the Seltzer
Yeah,
poll means much?
yeah, of course. So, I mean, when I first started studying US politics in any way, um, which would have been 2012, so some time ago now, yeah, we were taught like what wins United States presidential elections are swing states, and the two at the time in 2012 that were considered sort of bellwether states were Ohio, which selected the right answer, i.e., whoever Ohio selected all the way back to, I think, 1954, became president. Like the true bellwether state, and the other one was Florida. Now, demographics and Trump have kind of blown all of that out of the water, where Democrats no longer see Ohio as competitive and Florida as a lost cause, as far as it, their chance of getting anything from there goes, at least in the electoral college. So the ones we now look at, like this cycle, obviously Pennsylvania is the big one because out of the 7 states that have been identified as the swing states this cycle, that one has the most electoral college votes. The other ones are Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia, which is quite a surprise, being quite a solidly red southern state for so long,
Michigan.
and then Michigan and Wisconsin. And I think Nevada is also the
Nevada, yeah, yeah,
seventh.
yeah. I was gonna say Nevada, yeah. Because I'm looking at the which poll is this? This is on the Guardian US's website, and the swing states. I think these are the swing states that they're covering: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Anyway, sorry, go on.
Iowa is. I have seen that a poll has come out there which has put Kamala Harris at a substantial lead. I think it was something like 47-44 in
Mm-hmm.
favor of Kamala Harris, which, yeah, it's quite surprising. When I actually stayed in the United States for quite for a few months, it was Iowa that I was staying in. So yeah, when I saw that poll, bear in mind, I mean, this was like 2030, but actually 2014 was my time in Iowa, and obviously a lot's changed since then. But I was quite surprised when I saw that. It's some things must have certainly changed since I was there as far as leanings go for that poll to be right. But as I've
Mm-hmm.
just pointed out, like Ohio and Florida and all of these new swing states like Georgia in particular, it would have been unfathomable 20 years ago.
Well, I mean,
So maybe.
this is true, but also on the other hand, like if I take a very non-swing example, like let's say the state of New York, didn't Reagan win New York in '84? Maybe also in '80? Maybe I don't know. In '80, maybe he didn't.
Well,
Um,
I think there was actually. I think in 1984, Ronald Reagan won every state in the country apart from Minnesota, where his
yeah,
opponent was from.
yeah. Mondale had an absolutely disastrous campaign, obviously. Yeah.
Well, yes, well, when you're up against the great communicator, and you also have to remember, like that point in the 1980s, you still had this switch happening between the previously voting Democratic states of the South, who were moving towards Republicans, and then the northern states who were beginning to go towards Democratic, but were still at that point, you know, only
Mm.
recently, uh, you know, this way Republican typical voters.
Um.
So I
Well, I
mean, it
mean,
was a perfect storm for Reagan to sweep the nation. There.
well, I think also, I mean, the point that I just mentioned, well, half mentioned about Mondale is not a trivial one. I think by all measures and yardsticks, the campaign fought by Mondale in '84 was one of the most disastrous U.S. presidential campaigns of all time. Yeah. Anyway, I mean,
I mean, he was. I really looked at it. It was such a non-starter, wasn't it? It really was. It was such a landslide.
yeah. Um, it was, yeah, an absolute landslide. I think he got more than five. Yeah, he got, as I just said, except Minnesota or something. He got everything
Yeah,
almost.
it was his own state. He carried his own state. That was it,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly.
So well, in 2020, and well, actually, all the way up to inauguration. So in 2020 and early 2021. So we all remember um, how the courts played quite a crucial role in that period between election day and the inauguration of the new president. Do you think, or do you like envisage something similar happening this time? I mean, of course, like the things that happened in 2020 were quite extreme. Like there were instances where pressure was being put on election officials in Michigan to not certify results. There were very bizarre and now infamous phone calls between Lindsey Graham and the was he the Governor General or the Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger. I think Lindsey Graham asked him to look into ways to disqualify all mail-in ballots, and then afterwards, of course, infamously, Trump asked him to find for him 11,780 votes. And I think I have mentioned the fake electors, and as we were talking just before we started recording, I was also mentioning to you then, and which I'm going to re-mention it, the bizarre court case that was brought up by the Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, against Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin at the U.S. Supreme Court, because only the U.S. Supreme Court can rule on disputes between states to invalidate the results of the presidential elections in all of those states. And of course, the court eventually, only a few days later, put up a decision, not exactly a decision, put up a statement saying they were not going to hear the case based on some technicalities. And I believe Justices Alito and was it Thomas wrote, what is that thing that you write going against the majority decision? But this was not a decision in this case. And I believe they had written something saying they would have a minority opinion.
You're right. Yeah, it's normally a dissent.
Yeah.
It's
So they had,
dependent.
yeah, they had written that. So it was quite extreme, and I'm not even counting Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani, like, and their and all of the shenanigans and Jan 6 and everything else. So if we are to assume that, like 2020, this time also we will not know who the clear winner was for a few days after election day, how do you think the Harris and the Trump campaigns will conduct themselves in that period?
Well, I think you probably expect the Harris campaign to be fairly responsible and level-headed, and similar way that Biden was last time. Didn't jump the gun and declare himself the winner before they were absolutely certain Trump did it. what did Trump do? Trump declared himself the winner before all the votes had even been counted, and then instructed them to stop counting the votes.
Yeah,
It's remarkable, really.
I think
No, actually, it's not.
Giuliani had a had an outburst somewhere where he went, "How much more do you need to count?"
Oh yeah,
Anyway,
yeah. They were just making a lot of a lot of noise. So I don't know this time. One would hope that they've, in the case of Trump losing, they've learned their lesson that these actions can lead to deadly consequences. Um, and I mean, they've already done it once, and how people have somehow just put it to the back of their minds and thought, actually, this guy deserves another shot.
hmm
Is startling to me. I mean, it's no one could have. Well, you take his rhetoric from last time, and then when actually everything did happen, you say, well, I guess he did warn us that he would actually behave like this. But at the same time, you never really thought that he would do as
mm,
much as,
mm.
I mean, each day, each week, the more that came out, it was absolutely incredible.
In
And
any normal polity, the Jan 6 event should have been the final nail on the coffin, right?
yeah,
Like,
that or a second impeachment would have been
well, I mean, impeachments, one can
or
still argue that, like, the House impeaching and the Senate not impeaching, can I mean, these can still be done along political lines.
oh, yeah.
But I mean, Jan 6 should have been an absolute open and shut case, but it wasn't really, which was quite surprising because didn't Bolsonaro, whatever his name was, try to do something similar in Brazil after losing an election, and he was banned from running for political office for a good number of years. So now no one
Yes.
would look at the Brazilian political system and consider that in positive light in comparison against like any Western democracy, including even like I don't know Hungary or whoever. But
Yeah.
but
Well,
there you have it.
touched on quite an important thing here that has developed since that election now, which was a case that the Supreme Court decided in July of this year. It's called Trump versus United States, which basically was Trump saying that because he was president at the time of January 6th, he had immunity.
Mm,
And astonishingly, the court, I mean, a lot of people get the nuances wrong here, and they say that the court basically like sided with Trump and said that,
mm,
yes, like president is now a much bigger thing than what we previously conceptualized. And it is, but I wouldn't say it was an outright win for Trump. Um, so the particulars of that case basically decided that in acting in his official capacity as president, the amount of immunity that they are afforded is basically limitless now. So when it comes down to this investigation and these legal proceedings against Trump for January 6th, they basically have several much higher legal tests that they have to apply now. And I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but basically like 4 rounds of tests to show that when his involvement on January 6th was him acting as candidate Trump rather than as President
mm,
Trump. Uh,
Wow.
a remarkably incredible, really, decision that I mean, a lot of people said that this effectively makes
This something like this and an interpretation like this could have saved even Nixon.
oh well, Nixon would
He
have
could have
loved
said
it.
he was acting as President Nixon and not as candidate Nixon.
Yeah,
So whatever he was doing, or whoever was instructing to do do
yeah.
whatever was
I,
him acting in his
when I look through
presidential
like
capacity.
the details of this thing, it comes to my head like, oh, Nixon would have like loved this. This is basically what Nixon was saying all along. Like, as a president, I can be able, I should be able to do this without consequence. Yeah, it is it's Nixon's wet dream, really. This
Yeah.
decision because it just doesn't necessarily make the president unprosecutable. It just means that while they're acting as the president in the official capacity, they have immunity from criminal prosecution.
Do we really have that many examples of former presidents being prosecuted either in the US or anywhere else where you where you didn't have a complete change of the political system since the departure from office of that president? So for example, like an extreme example of a different kind would be Saddam Hussein being prosecuted in Iraqi courts in an Iraqi court under Iraqi law. But of course, like the US invasion had already happened, like the political system had changed basically. I can't think of any examples. Like maybe we will have to go all the way back to the English Civil War or this, or I don't know, 16 mid 1600s.
I know that no former US president has ever been charged with a crime, let alone found guilty of, of felonies. But as with many things, Donald Trump broke the mold on that one too, and he stands as the only one. Although it is worth caveating, had Ford not pardoned Nixon, it was very likely that he would have had been found guilty of.
That's right. Ford did pardon Nixon. That's right. That's right. I had forgotten that. But I think because Nixon had set a precedent by resigning, people were maybe willing to forgive him somewhat. I mean, I don't know.
I mean, Ford... I don't think the two prosecutors who were coming after him were too thrilled.
Right. Yeah. No, because I remember I'm looking at the electoral college map from the 1976 election, which was the only election that Ford fought as the incumbent president. I mean, of course, he lost that election to Jimmy Carter, but it doesn't look like it was a straight sweep. I mean, it wasn't. Well, no. What I'm trying to get at is just because Watergate had happened, and Watergate and other Nixon-related things were presumably fresh on people's minds when they were going into vote in 1976. The Republican Party wasn't completely impalatable to people. Yeah.
No, well, there's, like I mentioned earlier, there was a huge shift happening in what states looked like in terms of the color of the party they voted for, right, during that time. Because the Civil Rights Act basically upended Democrats in southern states. And part of Richard Nixon's masterstroke was to take those disaffected voters away from Democrats because they'd never vote for Democrats again. So he launched what was called the Southern Strategy, which is why he had such a landslide in 1972. I mean, he never even did that Watergate nonsense. He was going to win anyway because he was still getting Republican votes from the
motion sensitive.
He's still getting no worries. He was still getting like Republican votes from the northern states as well as hoovering up new Republican votes from the southern states. And Ford, got a was caught in some of the benefit of that, which is why he wasn't why the Republicans completely wiped out in that election. Maybe also some personal persona issues with Jimmy Carter or perceived issues with Jimmy Carter.
So on the question of courts, do you think courts will have to get involved between the election day this time and the inauguration of whoever, Biden or Trump, in January? Or will it be a more regular time for the courts this time around?
I mean, like the scope of how courts can be used in something like this is huge, right? I mean, you just think about 2020/21 alone, right? You had civil court proceedings going on that dragged in the companies that just made the voting machines. You had
there was a huge lawsuit. There was a huge lawsuit that one of those companies won, right, against Giuliani and his associates. Yeah, sorry, go on. So
And
go on.
Fox News was the really big one. Yeah, I think that was Dominion.
Dominion, yeah.
Dominion. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, inevitably somewhere there's going to be some court activity on the, surrounding the outcome of this election. At what level? God only knows. Last time it felt like all levels, just everywhere. As even as far as the Supreme Court, who obviously declined to hear the Trump campaign team's case. So yeah, I mean, I can't really speculate any more than that, because it's such a huge web of a legal system that your roots in and trying to predict where these cases will pop up and for what purpose is.
I mean, okay, that is a good point. That the scope here, like inherent in my question, was quite huge. So let me make it more limited scope-wise. Do you think there will be pressure campaigns against election officials in swing states to decertify votes that should be certified?
Oh yeah.
You think there will be?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was kind of unclear when I was reading about this. It's only been a few months ago. But certainly since 2020, there has been a concerted effort among Republican, some Democrat, but predominantly Republican activists to find ways to assert pressure on the official process of the elections, right? Now, this is, from what I understood from the story, this has actually been going on for some time at like lower local level elections, or state level ones. But the playbook has been expanded since 2020 to, all the way up to presidential elections, where they literally take, Republican, well, sometimes Democrat, but again, I've got to say, just it's fact, like mostly this has been Republican activity. They take activists or supporters or people who just respond to something that says, "Are you concerned about how your elections are conducted? Sign up now," and they literally put them through like a training course on how to invigilate election officials doing their job with very questionable legal and moral tactics to assert, either pressure, untoward pressure on the officials doing it, looking out for things that are obviously not there. I think part of the manual sounds like you should be looking out for any suspicious looking vote boxes that are just wheeled out from a back room. So yes, this is certainly going on. I have to say, so far, I haven't heard much of it happening or any like real stories about it happening at the moment. But I don't know if that's because it's not happening, or it's just because, well, this has sort of become like an accepted practice that has gone quite national, when previously it was just like a few like hyperactive like regional associations doing it, and so it's almost just like normalized to the point where it's not worth reporting on. That would be quite concerning.
Do you think there'll be a repeat of the fake electors nonsense?
Fake electors, probably. Depends on the results. Yeah, faithless electors. I'm guessing that's what you meant, faithless electors, right?
Yes. Yeah. Like the electors that the states would have sent to the capital had the other party won. I mean, they are ready anyway, so they just send them. And I mean, not just send them. Sorry, they just go uninvited.
Yeah, so the electors are the people who actually make up the electoral college, who get sent by their state to represent which like candidate one, and you have a weird quirk whereby they are not actually beholden. I mean, I think some states do compel them, but
they're
some
not
don't,
beholden to vote they're not beholden to reflect the election result from their home state once they are doing the representing. Yeah, that's right.
Right. Yeah.
Sorry, whilst they're doing the representing. Yeah.
Yeah. So that they've never affected an outcome of a presidential election, but then obviously the big talk about this one is that it is very, very close, and it's not outside the realms of possibility that we end up with a 269 for
Right.
each candidate.
Right. Do you think there will be a repeat of those um, phone calls between secretaries of state and the Republican secretaries of state and Trump campaign advisors or associates of Trump himself, asking them to find votes or to make ways for him to be declared the winner?
Well, I'm guessing this question is being asked in the context of we expect it to be Trump who would be doing this, not Harris doing something like that, right?
Or whoever, yeah, or the other way around.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
so, all right. So my take on that would be if I let's say if I was sat in one of if I was sat in well, actually no, neither one of the candidates this time as president.
That's right.
If Donald Trump was still president following that ruling in July, if I was in his team, I would feel a lot happier going around doing that than I would have done in
Ah, I
2020
see.
because of that ruling.
You can say that is
I
precedent.
think
No, no, but can't Harris say that is VP Harris? Oh, okay. VP doesn't have the same level of immunity, obviously. VPs don't have the same level of immunity. Right, right, right. So then you'd have
so.
to expect the presidential
Again,
office getting involved.
I don't really know that Trump or his team really consider like the legal consequences of their actions before they do them all that often. So yes, I can see it happening. And just from a pure like hypothetical, let's say a thought experiment where if one of them was currently already president and they decided to go and do that, I
Mhm.
legally speaking would feel a lot more comfortable in doing it now than I would have done in previous years because of the immunity that they've now been afforded by a Supreme Court ruling.
Just to, I mean, really press home this point. So there's been a ruling from the Supreme Court saying blah, but because it's not a parliamentary system, that blah doesn't have to be translated into law by the passing of legislation in any of the houses of government, right? So, for example, in the UK, if the UK Supreme Court, which of course is not at all an analogous legalistic body compared to the US Supreme Court, but still, if the UK Supreme Court said something like if the chief, do we have a chief justice? We don't have a chief justice. We have
Yeah,
a president of the Supreme Court or something, right?
yeah, equivalent.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Brenda Hale used to be that earlier, like a few years ago. I don't know who it is now. So anyway, if whoever is in that position says something, that is not law, just because they're saying it, right? Like what is law is
Well,
whatever the parliament, I mean, passes or
that's
judges to be.
on both sides.
I'm sorry.
They're not saying they're not what they say isn't like law. What they are saying is their interpretation of the law.
Can't the
So
ruling
I mean, like the
government?
Supreme Court,
Yeah, sorry, go on.
can't the ruling
My question was,
repeat the question?
like in a parliamentary system, can't the ruling government then disagree with the interpretation uh, forwarded by the Supreme Court and pass a piece of legislation saying exactly the opposite of that thing? And then because it's a
Yeah,
parliamentary
yeah.
system, that new piece of legislation will then be the new law.
So it's not so much about the parliamentary system that causes
Okay.
that. It's more, it, in the UK we have what we call like an organic constitution, and where we don't have like a constitution fully codified and written like they do have in the United States. Basically, our constitution is whatever the parliament of the day says it is. So yeah, you could in theory get around a Supreme Court ruling by writing a piece of. In fact, we had an example of this in this country only a few months ago, the Rwanda bill, where the Supreme Court said that like this country is not a safe country to be deporting these migrants or refugees to, and so the government's response was to make Parliament pass a bill declaring Rwanda a safe country.
Oh, right, right, right. Okay, okay.
That's their way around it. But in the States, it's quite different. Where and it's a lot more. We had a term for it when I was studying Yeah, so both of my dissertations in law were on constitutional jurisprudence of the United States Supreme Court, and something that we always like
I
get
meant
quite.
to. I'm so sorry, James. I meant to say that about you in your introduction. Sorry. Go on. I knew that. I knew that. Sorry. Go on.
That's okay. So something that we get like a lot of people have concerns with the Supreme Court in the United States is what they call legislating from the bench, i.e., basically doing Congress's job, but from an unelected position as the one of the top justices in the land, and that really comes around a lot where it's acts of Congress being struck down as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And there's quite, and not just acts of Congress as well, like acts of state level Congresses and or
Even
Senate or
even
whatever they call
executive orders can be put stays on, not just by the Supreme Court, by
it.
all other kinds of courts, right? This happened when Trump was
Eh,
trying to implement his so-called pan-Muslim, like his so-called Muslim ban, multiple times. Yeah,
yes,
sorry.
that's right. So that was stayed by a lower court, and then and then that lower court was overturned by the Supreme Court, who said that Trump could do that. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's right. Yeah, executive orders are can be subject to review, a judicial review by the Supreme Court. Doesn't
The
happen very often.
sorry, you were saying something about acts of Congress being struck down by unelected justices of the Supreme Court. So what was the like?
Yeah.
What was the fuller point there? You're just saying that these things have happened before and there have been like.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to get, well, I suppose it's answer to like your uh, previous thoughts about like the relationship between these two bodies and in yeah in the government. The Supreme Court wields a really strong hammer. They don't necessarily like write law that goes into the statutes in the United States, but they are the ultimate arbiters of what is constitutional and what is not constitutional. So they wield a really heavy hammer to be able to say that an act of Congress is not compatible with the Constitution in their interpretation, right? So writing laws, not so much. Invalidating laws, yes.
Right. This is interesting because I was going to come to the issue of abortion later. So there was Roe v. Wade, which was essentially a ruling on privacy. Like it was a privacy-based judgment in 72 or 73, whenever
73.
73, right? So, but didn't this year or last year the Supreme Court, quote unquote, strike it down? But the thing is, I remember reading about this before, that the fact that that the existence of Roe v. Wade was down to the judgment of the Supreme Court of the day, and the fact that it wasn't exactly something like, let's say, Obamacare, Affordable Healthcare Act, or whatever it was called. Like it wasn't something that had been passed by like the House of Representatives or the Senate, was an issue. So why would it be an issue if if I mean, what is the difference in legal weight between something that is that exists because it has been passed into law, it has been turned into law by the House of Representatives or the Senate, and something that exists as a right because the Supreme Court of the day has said so, in a judgment or in a ruling. Like, what's the difference in legal weight?
Basically, all right, well, let's take Roe v. Wade as an example. So Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022, actually, by a ruling called Dobbs. So Roe v. Wade, that established basically the Supreme Court identified or found or discovered a woman's right to an abortion within the wording of the Constitution, specifically under the 14th Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's because the Constitution was written so many years ago, there are just aspects of modern day life that the founding fathers who wrote it would have had no idea about it.
Sure.
And what the Supreme Court tries to do is try and translate their meaning at the time, like what were they trying to extend, this specific sentence granting, right to privacy to? What things that were unfathomable in their minds back then that we live with today would fall under that? So that's why it's sort of like called discovering rights under the Constitution. And Roe versus Wade was an early example of that. Roe versus Wade. So this is one of the most, if not perhaps the most famous Supreme Court decision, right up there with a few others like Brown versus Board of Education, and then perhaps some of the more infamous ones from times before then. But Roe versus Wade is probably the most talked about one in like everyday life in the United States, quite easily, because it was extremely controversial at the time. It was considered to be judicially activist, i.e., the judges basically overstretching their hand. Like this was something that, in many people's minds, should have been left to states to decide rather than the federal Supreme Court. And I first read Roe versus Wade when I was doing my undergraduate dissertation, and I returned to it again for my master's, because I was trying to look at decisions by the Supreme Court through the lens of judicial activism and judicial restraint. Like, are these actually useful ways of describing or measuring a court's approach or mindset towards its decision making? And the main thing I took away from Roe versus Wade back then was that I felt it was perhaps quite a shaky decision, legally speaking. I do
the original one.
Yeah, even though I'm fully supportive of female reproductive rights. I looked through that decision and read, God, and how many articles about it, and from different legal scholars. Some opposed, some in favor of it. The ones I found most persuasive to me was that, like, as far as outcome is concerned, Roe versus Wade was right. It was probably just not written in the best way, and that perhaps the real core of it is that Roe versus Wade was established under the umbrella of civil rights, right? So this was like identified as a right for women under a broader umbrella of civil rights, which you kind of expect from the time. There's actually a really great paper from, I think it was 2004, possibly 2007. No, it's 2 dates get mixed up. Around that time, where a scholar from Yale invited some other experts who all had a particular interest in Roe versus Wade to basically rewrite the decision, use all the information that the justices had at that time, but rewrite it in a way, in how they would, choose to write it. And the biggest standout change was that instead of looking at abortion rights or reproductive rights through the lens of civil rights, they looked at it as reproductive rights being a human right. And instead of identifying the right under the 14th Amendment, they identified it under the 13th Amendment, which is an amendment that's not very often cited or used since it was first introduced. But I found that quite compelling. And then as time has gone on, ever since Roe versus Wade, ever since Planned Parenthood case in 1992, abortion rights under Roe versus Wade have been gradually chipped away across the United States, either at a state level or then subsequently at a federal level. Just over and over, every few years, something was chipping away at it even more. And obviously, we look at that through the lens. We say, well, it's got a very conservative court makeup now, which is why it's happened like that. But also they had quite a lot of material to sort of go after, the applicants and then the justices themselves when writing their decisions. So it very important for this general election, I think, for this presidential election, the Roe versus Wade decision. I think it's galvanized a lot of people who might otherwise not have been galvanized to participate and vote in this election.
Yeah.
Overall, it's,
Also, I mean, that's a very excellent point. I think when I was saying earlier that I had read somewhere that legal legal scholars or legal pundits had often said that, actually no, the thing that I was going to say was that I did say was that, had it been had it okay, yeah, so yeah, staying on that question, so had it been a law because the House of Representatives had made it into a law and the Senate had agreed, what would have been the difference?
well, as far as I'm aware, before Roe versus Wade, like access to abortion was like handled by the states. It was a state matter, so some restricted it more
I see.
than others. It wasn't something that, like, the houses of Congress would, the House of Representatives and the Senate
I see.
touched, because it it was considered a state level matter. Roe versus
I see.
Wade changed everything because it established that there was, recognized under the Constitution, therefore applies everywhere. There is a constitutional right for a woman to have access to
I see. I see.
abortion.
This is really like massively interesting, even though, like, for those who are actually maybe in the crosshairs of this, it is not just an academic matter. It is a personal matter. It is a health matter. It is a rights matter, and so on. I was recently in the US, and I told you I was in Baltimore, and the airport is named after Thurgood Marshall, who was the first Black US Supreme Court justice. And I had mistakenly believed for a long time that Thurgood Marshall was a justice at the Supreme Court when Brown v. Board of Education had happened, but I think that is not true. So when I was in Baltimore, I thought, okay, let me just look into the history of Brown v. Board of Education, and it is so interesting. Like, Brown v. Board of Education was 1954, and Brown v. Board of Education, what's the word, overseated, or by its very ruling, made unlawful previous pronouncements of the Supreme Court that had been made as recently, well, from 1954, as 1908. There was a court case called Berea versus Berea College.
The key one in the build up to Brown versus Board of Education is called Plessy versus Ferguson, and it's
Yeah,
1896.
that's 1896. There is another, Berea College versus Kentucky, 1908. So that was the latest one, I think, pre 1954. And in all of the, there were several other ones. And in all of those cases, the Supreme Court had said that private educational institutions can prohibit, or can say that, oh, we are not going to admit both black and white, we are not going to admit black students, or we have the right to decide whether or not we want to admit students of all races. It is like, you look at the difference in years, 1908 to 54, so that's 46. So 72 plus 46 is 2018. So often, like, with the tide of time, things that are considered at one point extremely um, landmarky or extremely crucial get eroded, and like, thoughts start getting normalized and mainstreamized in the opposite direction. And just on a side note, I learned when I was looking into the Brown v. Board of Education thing, whilst I was in Baltimore, that there was a US Supreme Court justice called Harlan, John George, I looked him up just now, John Marshall Harlan, who was always dissenting against uh, Supreme Court rulings that were restrictive towards things related to civil liberties. So he was known as the Great Dissenter or whatever. So he dissented against the Brea College v. Kentucky ruling, maybe also against the 1896 one. Anyways, I think this time, I mean, okay, in 2016 there was the Access Hollywood tape. Now this is just about Trump and women in general. In 2016 there was Access Hollywood tape, which would have been the October surprise. Maybe it was not in October or September surprise. Had it not been, I mean, Hillary Clinton still believes, like, had it not been for Comey, she would have won that election. But I mean, that's a whole different topic, I'm sure. Um, because I mean I read A Higher Loyalty. I read Comey's book, and he argued a different line. But anyway, so now I mean, what has changed now between 2016 and 2024? What has changed in terms of what the public or what the voting population in the US know about Trump and his attitude towards sexual assault or rape or inappropriate sexual behavior? Not much, right? I mean, I know that only like a few days ago there were these tapes that were released. I mean, they were first talked about on Twitter, and then I think the Guardian US website released them of I think hundreds of hours maybe of Jeffrey Epstein talking. Maybe was it hundreds of hours or hundreds of minutes? Actually, hundreds of minutes doesn't really make any sense. Like of Epstein talking about Epstein, I don't know how it's supposed to be said, talking about Trump and his proclivity towards all kinds of inappropriate behavior. Do you think, I mean, this is just a political, like a voting question. Do you think these kinds of revelations will move the needle at all in 2024? Or maybe they have moved the needle, however, I mean, to the extent of possibility already. And there are people who are already as appalled as is possible with Trump, especially on this topic of his attitudes towards women and sexual behavior. What do you think?
I think if you've got to this point and you've supported Donald Trump, and then there's a revelation that he had like long conversations with Epstein, I can't really see how that revelation, after everything else, would really be the straw that breaks the camel's back. I think Trump supporters are crazily loyal. It's like he can do no wrong, and I mean, I think part of the reason for that is that people basically choose what news they hear now. In interviews with rally goers, and they're told this sort of information, you get a sort of mixture of reaction of it's not true, it's just lies from the Democrats, along that line. You get the quite unbelievable reaction, which is like, oh well, come on, I mean, it was going to be like that, he was in his 30s at the time, it's the 90s, just sort of like, yeah, you expect that. Well, I mean, I think that's really about all it's you never get like a moment of being like, oh God, did he really say that? Did he really do that? So real like introspection, really.
On the general question of, like, this is going back to a point that we have already talked about somewhat today. So on the general question of like the courts resisting America's decline into autocracy, or to decline into some kind of an anti-democratic reality for the whole country, like one is often tempted to get very romantic and say, like, even at the height of his popularity, FDR couldn't pass the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill to pack the courts. I mean, there are all kinds of examples of presidents who were extremely powerful, yet and who were yet like stopped by the courts, or who were, let's say, still unsuccessful in doing some things that would have maybe been possible in dictatorships or in democracies that were of less repute. So I mean, is that just a non-argument now after what happened in 2020? I mean, that kind of romanticized view of America and the health of its democracy in relation to the courts?
No, I mean, so when this sort of thing gets discussed, it's usually quite impassioned language. But the fact of the matter is, right, when the United States was first set up under the Articles of the Constitution, right, there was the idea was that each branch of the government sort of acts as a check on the other. So the president checks Congress, Congress checks the Supreme Court, Supreme Court checks the president, and vice versa. Like they're all supposed to check each other. When I first started studying like United States politics and the legal system, it was widely acknowledged, even like back in 2012 and from years before that as well, that as time has gone on, the powers and scope of the president's role has expanded, either through like the greatly increased use of things like executive powers and what the amount of like leeway they get to operate the military as commander in chief, especially abroad, etc., etc. Like the power and scope of the president's role has dramatically increased since the time of like George Washington and a lot of other like subsequent presidents. Congress, who, by the way, have the largest amount of words in the Constitution dedicated to what their role and activity is, has sort of gone the other way. And that's partly self-inflicted because it's so divided and just the way it's set up, it really struggles to do a lot. It's just sort of like a noisy chamber where like a couple of bills might squirt out every now and again. And then on the other side, the Supreme Court, the power for the Supreme Court to do a judicial review, i.e., scrutinize an act of Congress and declare it constitutional or not constitutional, the Supreme Court actually gave itself that power. It's not written in the Constitution that it has the power to do that. It gave itself that power in, I think, 1808, in a case called Marbury versus Madison. Well worth looking up. I mean, in a way, it was kind of inevitable. Alexander Hamilton, I think, wrote quite a lengthy thing about the fact that courts would need to have the power of judicial review to make them, in any sense worthwhile. But you see how powerful the Supreme Court is now with that power, which it gave itself. It wields quite a lot. And you talked earlier about the Trump versus United States decision. For us who have looked at this for a really, really long time, obviously that decision is really shocking because we're looking at it through the lens of Trump could be president with that power. But I would say that has kind of been consistent with the trend of how the power is divided and wielded between the three branches going back over 100 years now. Well over 100 years, probably. It's really just how they were originally balanced is just no longer the reality. The president is vastly more powerful than the Constitution ever imagined. And the court is probably fair to say disproportionately powerful for what it is. And not just talking about the Supreme Court there, but the entire federal court structure that sits beneath it as well. And Congress, like I say, mostly through their own fault, have been quite left as the losers in the power balance.
Right, but still, when it comes to the very process through which the winner of a presidential election gets certified, it is still, I mean, a little sketchy, isn't it? Like, for example, last time, what was the name of Tom's VP? Mike Pence, right? Mike Pence. So it would have been it would have been down to Mike Pence to certify. It would have been down to the sitting VP, right? It was down to Mike Pence to certify the results. I mean, of course, that's not really a problem this time because I'm pretty sure even if Harris loses, like she wouldn't have any issues with certifying the results of the election. I mean, I hope she wouldn't. But I mean, don't you think like that is quite a bit of a stretch to assume that a system that is so fraught with, places where human error can sweep in, can come in, or human corruption can come in, or individual corruption or individual error can come in, would
so
hold
this
up
was a
again?
big thing back in 2020 and 2021, wasn't it? There was this idea put out by the Trump campaign that Mike Pence effectively had the power to like decertify.
Exactly, and then it would go down to it would have gone down to a vote between senators or something. Anyway, sorry, go on.
I mean, obviously we don't know how it played out because Mike Pence did do his job. But like from what I remember at the time, there isn't isn't actually a pathway for the vice president to decertify the election results. It was just made up by
Really?
Trump supporters. Yeah, like there isn't a procedure, like there isn't a legal procedure for him to follow to decertify, right? And I mean,
Not
we don't have to
decertify, but
even go
say but to refuse to certify. He can still refuse to
to
certify.
certify whatever language they, yeah, whatever language they've used. I remember at the time, like as Mike Pence's team knew, and like uh, other constitutional scholars were pretty clear that this is just like a procedural step, right? This does not in any way invalidate the election results or change them. So I don't really know what their long-term goal with that is. And we only have to go back to 2000 for a losing vice
Mm-hmm.
president to
Mm-hmm.
who certified the winner. Who was
That's right. Yeah, and Al Gore. I mean, I think he did one concession, then took back that concession, and then conceded again. Right?
yeah, so he conceded way too early. And then when they realized Florida was actually going to be a lot closer, or perhaps he could actually be the winner in Florida, he unconceded. And then he only conceded after the Supreme Court ruled that W. Bush won Florida, basically. That was a
Oh,
messy
I
one.
see. After. No, did the
Oh,
Supreme
yeah.
Court rule exactly that, or did the Supreme Court rule that no more recounts were necessary? I don't remember.
Basically,
Right, right.
yeah.
And I
Basically,
mean,
like the window for a recount had passed. I think was
right,
the
right.
put it.
Like in general, do you think it the election will be tight this time?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, that's certainly what I'm seeing. Like across the polls, I had a look yesterday, and they're on a knife edge, and
I was
I
seeing
think
some I was seeing some political journalists, like British political journalists, like Emily Maitlis. Well, she's a podcaster now, I guess. But I mean, as you know, she was a very top political journalist for a very, very long time. Say on Twitter that if Selza is putting Harris at 47 in Iowa, then she can take some of the other swing states by bigger margins. And if that happens, then apparently it is not going to be close. But there are too many ifs,
I
obviously, here.
yeah, so the only polls I um have been following on this have been Race to 270 and Politico's poll of polls, because they're aggregate polls that they host on their sites. So they take all the
Let me have a
polls
look.
done by each state, and they basically pull up an average line as a way to try and get like as representative picture of where the polls actually are overall. And yeah, I mean, polling is a fraught exercise, very open to margins of error to all sorts of scales, depending where the poll's being held and what the circumstances around
Yeah,
um,
it is more of a mathematical
are.
question or a statistical question than a political one, which is why what political journalists, no matter how veteran they are saying on this matter is probably less relevant. My light has gone off again. Yeah,
I mean, I think we can probably just polls are polls. They give us like a little bit of an idea. They give us a flash of like intention, and in a single moment. But 2016 polls were wrong. 2020 ish, they got it about right. This time, who knows? It's one thing that did like concern me was if people have the impression that the polls have sort of swung, especially in these swing states, have swung sort of one way or another, what effect that will have on the people who might be voting for that person, whoever it currently looks in favor for. If they're like, oh, well,
there
they're
might be
going to win
more. There
anyway.
might be more no shows. There might be more no shows. Exactly.
So I bet, I mean, as nice as this Iowa poll sounds, I bet the Harris team, if they're doing their job right, will be downplaying it as much as possible.
I mean, again, this is again a political question. Do you think the incumbency will go against Harris in some of those swing states? Like if she is campaigning on a platform of doing better things,
Mm.
because she is in the incumbent administration, surely voters will think, well, what do you mean? You are going to do better than what your current government is doing right now. I mean, that is often a problem, which is why the conservatives winning elections after elections here in this country used to be a conundrum for people, which is why that party in Singapore, which has probably won every single election or something since independent Singapore has existed, has been a conundrum. I mean, so anyway, don't you think? I think I'm correct with the Singapore example, but don't you think this could be an issue with voters in swing states?
So I think the on the incumbency, I think it would be fair to say that Biden has had a pretty good record. Not great, but certainly better than his predecessor. Uh,
Mm.
I think the it's so hard sometimes to like try and analyze these things through like incumbency record and everything, because ultimately this election hasn't really come down to policy so much or like defending
Mm.
records. It is honestly just like a noisy popularity contest, and try and I find it really difficult. It didn't used to be like this. It used to be like, I remember Obama and Romney, like analyzing that election was really like fascinating, because you could actually
That was 100% policy election. That's right.
yeah, you could draw up clear policy dividing lines. And in a way you can with this, but like the way Trump presents what he plans to do isn't like how we normally try and approach analyzing, policy, because he didn't really give any detail. It's just like, mass deportations, bans from these countries, tariffs on these. And it's completely different to what like Harrison Waltz is saying. It's not even like on the same planet. They're talking about like putting a cap on insulin prices. That's something I'm more accustomed to analyzing and scrutinizing as a policy announcement. So it's yeah, it's really
Yes.
hard to say like, well, what does it actually mean to be an incumbent fighting this election? I don't
I
know.
mean, of course, I'm not. I'm not. I think we're probably of the same age. Like, I don't remember electoral campaigns for presidential elections going all the way back to the 80s, obviously, but I've like read about them or seen videos about them. So 2012, Romney Obama was a policy election. 28, McCain Obama was probably also a somewhat policy election. I don't think Kerry Bush 2004 was a policy election. Maybe Al Gore Bush was a policy election somewhat.
2004 was a huge foreign policy election, really.
Oh, foreign policy, yeah, but in terms of domestic, but foreign policy, that was a singular issue. I mean, there was Iraq and Afghanistan and 9/11 and but I mean, was Kerry, I mean, I'll have to look back at the transcripts of the debates, or the videos of the debates. Was Kerry a vocal critic of going into Iraq? I don't think so. Was was Kerry? It would have been about what to do going forward. But I'm saying if you go back even further,
I would
Al
say there's
Gore.
actually quite a lot of domestic policy on there as well. Like
Okay,
the,
okay, I
the
didn't.
whole theme was really like was framed in like the very traumatic post 9/11 world, where home
Right.
security at home was everything. Fighting, taking down the people who did that was like the big thing, and those two things hand in hand worked very well for
Okay.
he had like Department of Homeland Security being launched, and um, raft
Right.
of
Right. No, no,
uh,
no, I understand. That's right. That's right. That's right. Because okay, the thing that I was the conjecture that I was going to go for would have been. I mean, you have disproved it now. But like you have given me a contract from would have been quite a bold one. I would have said that 92, Bush senior Clinton was a policy election somewhat. 96 definitely wasn't. That Bob Cole, Bob Dole, whoever that guy against Clinton. Al Gore Bush was maybe somewhat of a policy, but that was an anti-incumbency thing also to an extent. But like Clinton had excellent things to show. I mean, well, the Clinton Gore administration had excellent things to show, even internationally, right? There was Ireland, there was Bosnia to an extent. Um, yeah, so I was going to say like US elections, because of the very referendumy outlook, is often are often popularity contexts.
I say if you're interested in 1992, it's an election I look at a lot because I happen to think H.W. Bush is a highly underrated president.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at 1992 and 2008, they are probably close to being the most comparable to one another in
Okay.
quite a number of years because what was dominating the
Taxes. Like read my lips, there will be no more. That was 92, right?
well, yeah. That obviously became like a very important thing from 1988. That he campaigned on that in 1988,
Okay. Yeah.
and then in during following that promise, he actually did raise taxes, and probably for good reasons too, in his defense. But what dominated both 2008 and 1992 was that there'd basically just been a bit of an economic shock, right? Obviously, 1992 was not quite the scale of 2008 with the financial crash, but that's what was like dominating the campaigns for
Mm-hmm.
both of them.
Right. Yeah. 2008 definitely was.
They were in recession in 1992.
Yeah. And of course, like the world was, like the fall of the Soviet Union and several other things. Yeah, I mean, I think in the last conversation that we recorded with, I mean, you and Catherine, we talked about how the importance of foreign policy in US elections is often overestimated. Like the average Joe is not, I mean, in all likelihood, going to think about what the image of America might be in Afghanistan when he's trying to decide which way to vote. But maybe 2004, like, there have been some exceptions. So in terms of foreign policy, do you think things like, I don't know, Israel, Hamas, or Ukraine, Russia, or any of the other things will be like huge factors this time, the way 9/11 was in 2004? Not really, right?
So I would highlight a great article. It was published only in the last couple of weeks on Politico, and it's almost written like a love letter to Europe, saying, "Sorry, Europeans. Ever since 1990, your average United States citizens' interest in you and
Mm,
other things going on abroad, maybe the Indo-Pacific excluded, is really not something they think about anymore. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, like as time has gone on, Americans' interest in what goes on, either economically or militarily, with Europe, and probably extend that somewhat to Israel as well. It's not what it used to be. I think Europe has been quite slow to realize that, UK included, which we only just really woke up to it with the combination of Putin invading Ukraine and Donald Trump in a shot becoming president again.
Actually, I mean, since you brought up 1992, Israel was involved. Well, the issue of Israel was involved in that election in a very different way, if you remember. Like there was a huge loan uh, that had been sanctioned by the Congress for Israel to help them with uh, their settlement efforts with, no, with the assimilation efforts for Jewish people coming into Israel from the erstwhile Soviet Union. I think it was $6 billion or no, not million, surely, trillion, something. Yeah, anyways, I think there was a conference in Madrid, and Bush Senior was somewhat in favor of not making that loan like proviso free. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, like I'm what's the word? Simplifying things that maybe should not be simplified for people who know better. And Clinton had run on this issue from the right, saying, if I become president, Jewish Americans won't have to face this kind of humiliation. So I don't know if it was a huge needle moving factor in 1992. I mean, I have no way of knowing. Actually, maybe I have ways of knowing if I do the research, but I haven't done the research or the reading to know if this was really a huge factor in 1992. But I don't know. This time, like I can give you a baby example. So I was in California in August for a very small conference. I was at the University of Southern California. There were so many entrances and exits into and out of the university campus that were, let's say, allowed on a Friday, but not allowed on a Saturday, allowed on the evening, or like, I don't know, 12 noon onwards on the Saturday, but not on Sunday. Why? Because of protests by students, because of blocking up of roads and other things. So if you visit the university towns, if you visit the the centers of population in the US, where most of the population or most of the young population are very, very, let's say, animated, very, very, not exactly obsessed, maybe obsessed is the correct word for some people on this issue, you would get the impression that maybe all of America is considering this to be a huge factor in deciding who to vote and who to not vote for. Because as you remember, in 2016, there were lots of people, lots of anti-Trump, like liberal people who stayed home, who didn't want to go out and vote for Hillary Clinton. And I think some of them had voted for, like, who was the third party candidate, Jill Stein or someone.
Should have been Green Party candidate. Yeah.
Yeah, some people, some other people, uh, like that. So I mean, so you am I right in understanding that you are saying that probably this time Israel Gaza is not exactly like a huge issue in people's minds? I mean,
Well,
in states where swings can happen,
I mean, for
there
some
is.
people, it will be huge. Um, there's going to be very strong feelings. I mean, America's such a big place, right? And
Sure,
there
yeah.
are bits around the country where you will have, you know, like really old, like Jewish communities, like in New York, who will
Mm-hmm,
feel one
mm-hmm,
way about this issue, and then perhaps more some Palestinian-oriented communities as well around the country that will feel the other way. And then you also have the typical dividing line between age groups and how they view Israel versus Gaza
mm-hmm.
and Palestine. So I wouldn't say like it's just an apathetic attitude. I think just as like the national psyche, they are much more. America is increasingly become, and Donald Trump just exacerbated this, a lot more inward looking.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this sort of perpetuated by America first, and like if
Yeah,
it's
yeah, almost to the point of self-obsession, right? Like Trump wants to pull America out of NATO. He has already pulled America out of the Paris climate thing, out of
Joe Biden rejoined it, but then he says it's going to pull us out again. So
out
basically,
of
like,
that trade thing, and was it NAFTA or something? I mean, anyway, yeah.
yes, he renegotiated. Well, yeah, he basically like did a worse version of, well, not in his view, but yes, basically renegotiated
Mm-hmm,
NAFTA,
mm-hmm.
or its replacement was called.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it is almost to the point of self-obsession, in the circles of America that will matter in terms of like swings or non-swings. Um, that it is US first in a very literal sense. So I see people. I mean, I remember.
By the way, I would just say that that's.
Go on, go on.
I'll just highlight that I look around other countries as well. Obviously, US is like my. I've got more academic background in there, and more of the UK than other countries. But this America First thing is not unique to
Mm,
America. We're
mm,
seeing this kind of, and it's typically right wing, but not always, and it's definitely nationalistic. Um, Sentiment spreading in many countries, the UK included, Germany is very much so, France as well. Um,
mm,
it's not a uniquely American syndrome. It's just one that perhaps went the furthest in the first election of Donald Trump, but I think that the sort of feeling that he rode off back then has only sort of gained momentum and acceptability amongst a larger portion of the population in the years
that's right.
since that. Perhaps to the same scale as some other like rich Western developed countries. But we are seeing them grow, and it's something that it should have a lot of us very nervous.
That's right. I think we have been speaking for a while, so maybe I can end with a general question about the role of courts in elections going forward. In general, like, do you have any, I don't know, hopes or wishes about how you think in healthy democracies courts should intertwine themselves or not with the election running machine or the election running process?
So really, as with
Processes, I should say. Yeah, the various kinds of elections.
I think there's a general rule, right? Like with courts and the application of courts in any kind of process is they are meant to be there for when something's gone a bit wrong, rather than there to be like an integral part of the process itself.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously that I would expect and hope that that kind of you know remains the case. Where there's a dispute around a specific aspect in an election, yes, that's exactly what you have courts available to resolve. I mean, as these things get seemingly ever more divisive, I expect the sort of applications going to courts to settle disputes around elections to go up. But if you want maybe my my view in how, out of all decisions ever made by the Supreme Court, one of them stands particularly potent as being considered like it's quite a bad one. I mean, there are loads of lists out there listing like people's opinions on like what are the worst Supreme Court decisions ever. Dred Scott normally tops it, but one from more recent times that regularly makes it up there is Bush v. Gore. That one is up there a lot because
not Citizens United.
Well, for me personally, Citizens United ranks about as toxic as they come, maybe with the exception of some of those from the 19th century. But that was just because it was central to my personal.
Yeah, go on. Bush v. Gore.
Bush v. Gore, having a scenario where you have 9 unelected and 5 out of 4 conservative-leaning justices picking the next president of the United States. That was pretty unpalatable. It was obviously extraordinary circumstances that led it to being there. But at the end of the day, like it might as well have just been a bonus round of voting because the 5 conservative justices picked the conservative guy and the 4 liberal justices picked the other one.
Several rounds of recounts had already happened, right, in Florida?
Yeah. Yes, and they found a worrying pattern of what they called basically like spoilt ballots called hanging chads because of the way that they had been designed. Basically, ones that on review should have been counted weren't being counted because they were thought spoiled.
Okay. Yeah, well, yeah, that's. I mean, a friend of mine once told me of this example. I think I brought this up briefly before we started recording today. In the 2015 UK general election, there was a constituency in Scotland, maybe in Dundee, where the winning candidate, the difference between the votes gotten by the winning candidate and the votes got by the person who came second was 2 or 1. I think Dundee 2015. So I mean, like, was it somewhere in Dundee? I want to say. Election results for Dundee. I mean, I'll have to maybe somewhere in Scotland. It was either 2015 or some other election. Let me just quickly see if I can substantiate what I just tried to say here. If not, I will call it today. SNP Dundee 2.27%. Okay, it's just talking about percentages, not the exact number of votes. Anyway, yeah, might have been Dundee. SNP. Yeah, the Lib Dems beating Scottish nationalist, but anyway, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'll have to recheck this. Right. Okay. Thank you very much for your time, James, and for all the answers and the opinions and the insights and the explanations. It would be great if you stayed on for a few more minutes after I stop recording. But yeah, thank you again for your time.